Half of Buddhism called this heresy. The other half called it the Buddha's true teaching, and both were ready to fight for it. This is the story of Mahayana Buddhism. Around the 1st century BCE, Buddhism did something almost no religion survives. It split in half. Both sides believed they were protecting what the Buddha actually taught, not politics, not power. A single devastating question. What if we've been understanding the Buddha wrong this whole time? New texts started appearing, texts that claimed to reveal what the Buddha really meant. Texts that said the path we covered in our last video, the 4 stages to becoming an arhat. That was the beginning. Training wheels. Today, over 500 million people across East Asia practice Mahayana, China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, Vietnam. But it began as something far more controversial. A group of monks who looked at enlightenment itself and said, "That's not the end. That's not even the point." The established schools? They rejected it completely. So where did these texts come from? And why did they split Buddhism down to its foundations? Northern India, around 100 BCE. You're a Buddhist monk. You've memorized the Pali Canon. You're following the path we covered in our last video, working toward becoming an arhat, escaping samsara forever. Someone hands you a text you've never seen before, a text that claims to be the Buddha's words, and it's saying, "You've been doing it wrong." New Sutras, appearing between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, almost 4 centuries after the Buddha's death. The Prajaparamita literature, the perfection of wisdom texts, written in Sanskrit, not Pali, the language of the established canon, teaching things the traditional texts never mention, and making an explosive claim, these are the Buddha's true teachings. This is Mahayana Buddhism emerging. The established schools reacted with immediate rejection. Where were these texts for 400 years? If the Buddha taught this, why didn't anyone record it? This contradicts what we've preserved for centuries. Accusations flew, fabrication, corruption, false prophecy. The Sarvastivada school, one of the most influential at the time, dominant in northwest India, rejected them outright. So did most Stavira schools. Some communities banned these texts entirely. Remember what we covered in our Theravada video? That entire tradition built its identity on preserving the earliest teachings unchanged. Now someone was claiming there are higher teachings, teachings the elders missed. A war over legitimacy. Because if these texts were real, everything you've been practicing might be incomplete. And if they weren't, this was the biggest fraud in Buddhist history. To its critics, this wasn't evolution. This was distortion. Mahayana defended itself with a revolutionary claim. The Buddha taught in layers, upaya, skillful means. The early teachings were real but preliminary. Like teaching addition before calculus, the Mahayana Sutras were the advanced teachings, hidden until people were ready. Some claimed they were preserved by Nagas, serpent beings in underwater palaces. Others said Bodhisattvas transmitted them from the Tusita heaven. The texts themselves say this teaching was too radical for the early disciples. And to this day, we still don't have a clear answer about where these texts came from. What we do know is this: the texts appeared, and they spread. A war over what the Buddha actually taught. Imagine archaeologists discovering scrolls claiming to be lost gospels, written 400 years after Jesus in a different language, teaching things never mentioned in the Bible. They say, these are Jesus's true teachings, hidden until humanity was ready. Half embraces them, half calls it blasphemy. That's the stakes. And these new texts weren't adding details or clarifying points. They were rewriting the entire goal of Buddhism. The Arhat path, everything we covered in the last video, Mahayana said it was real, but it wasn't enough. There was a higher path. When the elder traditions heard what that path was, some called it madness. What claims shattered Buddhism in half? Three teachings made the established schools reject Mahayana. Each one on its own was controversial, together revolutionary. Claim 1, everything is empty. The Prajnaparamita Sutras appeared. Their core teaching, shunyata, emptiness. Nothing exists independently. Everything arises through interconnection. Nothing has a fixed, separate essence. The Heart Sutra. Listen to these lines. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness is form. The Buddha taught anatta, no self. Your self is an illusion. Mahayana said, everything is like that. The five aggregates, the khandhas we think make up reality, empty. Even the dhammas, the fundamental building blocks of existence, empty. Think of a wave. You can point to it, photograph it, name it. But it's just water temporarily taking a shape. The wave doesn't exist apart from the ocean. It's not nothing. It's right there. But it has no independent existence. Mahayana says, everything in reality is like that wave. That's the shift. Conservative schools called it nihilism. That was the first crack. But Mahayana wasn't done. Claim 2, you're already a Buddha. The next wave of texts claims something even stranger. All beings already possess Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha. You're not becoming enlightened, you're uncovering what was always there. The Lotus Sutra, everyone will eventually become a Buddha, not just escape to nirvana. We just learned the 4 stages in our last video: stream entry, once returner, non-returner, arhat. A path of achievement through effort. Mahayana said, you're not building something new, you're removing obscurations from what's already complete. Polishing a mirror versus building one from scratch, which means, in a sense, you were never unenlightened to begin with. You just didn't know it. The elder traditions pushed back. If everyone's already a Buddha, why are we suffering? This contradicts the entire path of practice. Mahayana's response: a lamp covered in dust is still a lamp. Practice doesn't create Buddha nature, it reveals it. Imagine being told you don't need to become healthy, you need to remove the disease. Your natural state is already whole. Illness is the deviation. That shift in framing changes everything. And then, the third claim arrived. This is where things get strange. Claim 3, the Buddha lied to you. The Lotus Sutra's teaching on upaya, skillful means. The sutra tells this story. A wealthy man's house catches fire. Inside, his children play, completely unaware the walls are burning around them. The father stands outside screaming, "The house is on fire, get out, you'll die." The children don't move, they're absorbed in their games. So the father makes a choice, he lies. "I have toys outside, carts pulled by goats, carts pulled by deer, beautiful ox carts. Come see them." The children race outside, they're saved. Were there carts? No. Did the lie save their lives? Yes. The Lotus Sutra says, That's what the Buddha did. The Buddha didn't teach one truth, he taught strategically, and that changes everything. Different teachings for different capacities. Some teachings were expedient lies told to get you to practice. The Arhat path? Real, valid, but not the final truth. Not because it wasn't true, but because you weren't ready to hear it. The established schools were enraged. You're saying our entire canon might be lies? How do we know what's true and what's skillful deception? Convenient. Anything you disagree with you call preliminary teaching. Mahayana's justification. The Buddha himself used skillful means, taught meditation to calm people, karma to inspire ethics. But the ultimate truth? Emptiness, Buddha nature, universal liberation. The Arhat path gets you somewhere, personal liberation. The highest teaching is the Bodhisattva path, universal liberation. The name tells you everything. Theravada, Sarvastivada, other schools. Mahayana called them Hinayana, lesser vehicle. Their own teaching, Mahayana, great vehicle. Theravadins rejected this term entirely, saw it as an insult. What just happened? These texts claimed reality isn't what you think. You're already enlightened, you don't know it yet. The Buddha lied to most people about the true path. And then they said, this is the real Buddhism, everything else is preliminary. Nagarjuna, around the 2nd century CE, would later systematize all of this in his Mula Madhyama Kakarika. He wrote, there is no difference between samsara and nirvana. The limits of nirvana are the limits of samsara. Between the two, there is not the slightest difference. If everything is empty, if everyone is already a Buddha, if the Buddha taught skillfully, then the separation between suffering and liberation dissolves. That's the Mahayana revolution. The elder traditions saw it as corruption of everything the Buddha taught. And at the center of all of it, a new kind of enlightened being. Not the Arhat who escapes, the Bodhisattva who returns. What this actually meant, not in philosophy and practice, in a human life. A monk, lifetimes of practice. He's shattered the 10 samyojanas, the fetters we covered in our last video. He's reached Arhat enlightenment, standing at the edge of final nirvana. No more rebirth, no more suffering, no more anything, just eternal peace. One step forward and he's free forever. He hears it behind him. The world still burning, billions of beings trapped in suffering. He could leave. He's earned the right to leave. And instead, he turns around, walks back into samsara voluntarily, takes a vow to be reborn again and again and again, not because he failed, but because he chose to. That's the Bodhisattva. The elder traditions looked at this and said, that's not enlightenment, that's insanity. Bodhisattva, Sanskrit bodhi, awakening, sattva, being, awakening being. Someone who generates bodhicitta, the aspiration to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. The vow. From the Brahma Jala Sutra. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it. Not, I'll help a few people. I'll save everyone across infinite lifetimes, across infinite universes. The shift in goal. Arhat, escape suffering for yourself. Bodhisattva, end suffering for all beings. We just learned the Arhat path, destroy craving, achieve nirvana, exit completely. Mahayana, that's one finish line, there's a higher one. The established schools rejected this completely. The Buddha taught liberation from samsara. You're choosing to stay in it? This contradicts the entire point, ending suffering. You're not enlightened if you're still being reborn. You're not done. Others argued, this delays your enlightenment unnecessarily. Why make it harder? Mahayana's response, compassion isn't a virtue, it's the path itself. Personal liberation without compassion is incomplete. You can't truly be free if you leave everyone else in chains. The Bodhisattva achieves the same realization as the Arhat, but uses it differently. Not an exit strategy, a re-entry strategy. The great Bodhisattvas. Avalokiteshvara, compassion itself, becomes Guanyin in China, Kannon in Japan. Manjushri, wisdom personified. Ksitagarbha, vowed not to become a Buddha until all hells are empty. We covered Tara. She vowed to achieve enlightenment as a woman to help female practitioners, pure bodhisattva thinking. We covered Maitreya, the future Buddha currently waiting as a bodhisattva in Tusita heaven. We covered Padmasambhava, bringing Mahāyāna Vajrayana to Tibet. And this is the part that shocked even some Mahayana monks. The story goes that Santadeva, an 8th century Indian monk, was considered lazy by his monastery. He seemed to do nothing but eat and sleep. To humiliate him, they forced him to give a teaching in front of everyone. He stood up and recited the Bodhicaryavatara, the way of the Bodhisattva, a text so profound it's still studied today. The final verse. For as long as space endures, for as long as sentient beings remain, may I too remain, to dispel the misery of the world. Then, according to legend, he rose into the air and disappeared. Some say he achieved Arhat enlightenment and left. Mahayana says he became a bodhisattva and went to work. The controversy. To Theravada, this is attachment, you're clinging to beings. To Mahayana, this is the highest form of non-attachment, you're free enough to stay. An emergency room doctor burns out, quits medicine, finds peace in a quiet life. Then hears about a mass casualty event. No staff, overwhelmed ER, people dying in hallways. They could stay home. They've earned their peace, but they go back because they can't not. A friend who keeps showing up even though your depression is exhausting them. A parent who stays in the difficult conversation instead of walking away. Or a colleague mentoring the intern everyone else gave up on. They've earned their boundaries, but they don't, not yet, not while you need them. Trauma, some would say, love, others would insist. Mahayana calls it enlightenment. Mahayana didn't just say this was an option, they said it was the superior path. They called their vehicle great and everyone else's lesser. A declaration of supremacy. And it worked. Within a few centuries, the minority view became the majority. So why did the heretics win? By the 2nd century CE, Mahayana was spreading along the Silk Road. By the 12th century, Buddhism had virtually disappeared from India, a combination of Muslim invasions that destroyed monasteries like Nalanda, loss of royal patronage, and absorption of Buddhist practices into Hinduism. But Mahayana, it had already conquered an entire hemisphere. Remember when we covered how Buddhism split into 3 schools? This is how Mahayana became the dominant one. Not by force, by meeting people where they were. 4 reasons. First, accessibility. A farmer in China could practice Pure Land Buddhism while working his fields. A merchant's wife in Japan could chant Amitabha's name while raising children. You didn't need to abandon your life to follow the path. Theravada required renunciation. Mahayana met you where you were. Second, hope. Theravada's message, work for lifetimes, maybe you'll escape. Mahayana's message, you're already a Buddha, wake up. Everyone can become a Buddha, not just escape suffering. Third, devotion. You can pray to Bodhisattvas for help. Avalokiteshvara, Amitabha, Pure Land Buddhism. Faith in Amitabha Buddha can get you to a paradise where enlightenment is easier. And this is where it gets interesting. You don't need to be virtuous your entire life. According to some Pure Land teachers, even someone who's lived violently, killed, stolen, harmed others, can be reborn in the Pure Land by sincerely calling Amitabha's name 10 times at the moment of death. The elder tradition said, karma is inescapable. Actions have consequences across lifetimes. In some interpretations, faith could override karma. That didn't just expand Buddhism, it revolutionized it. Fourth, flexibility. Skillful means justified adapting to local cultures. In China, it merged with Taoism, creating Chan, which later became Zen. In Tibet, it blended with Bon traditions, forming Vajrayana, and everywhere it went, it absorbed local deities' practices and art. Theravada preserved the tradition. Mahayana adapted to each culture it touched. 3 regions. In China, from the 1st century CE onward, texts were translated into Chinese and new forms began to emerge. Chan Buddhism, what we now call Zen, blended meditation with spontaneity, and Pure Land became the most popular path, with devotion to Amitabha spreading through ordinary people. Later, in Japan, Zen would merge with samurai culture, but it wasn't unified. Schools like Madhyamaka and Yogacara debated for centuries, emptiness versus consciousness itself. In Tibet, between the 7th and 8th centuries, Mahayana took on a new form, Vajrayana, with its tantric practices. Padmasambhava played a key role in bringing Buddhism to Tibet. The Dalai Lama tradition emerged, seen as Avalokiteshvara, returning again and again through reincarnation. Preserved texts when Buddhism declined in India. Tensions existed. Indian Mahayana traditions had to merge with indigenous Bon practices, not always peacefully. Across Japan, Korea, and Vietnam from the 5th to the 8th century, each culture developed its own Mahayana traditions. In Japan, Zen, Pure Land, and Nichiren all emerged and competed fiercely, each claiming to preserve the true teaching. In Vietnam, figures like Thich Nhat Hanh would later develop what we now call engaged Buddhism. Theravada remained strong in Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos. Never spread as widely but preserved the Pali Canon meticulously. Different approach, conserve versus adapt. Both survive today, but Mahayana has roughly double the practitioners globally. When Westerners think Buddhism today, they're usually thinking Mahayana. By the time Buddhism was erased from its birthplace in India, Mahayana had already become the living tradition across China, Tibet, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. The controversial texts that the elder traditions called heresy, they became the foundation for 500 million people's spiritual lives. The monks who turned back, they became the heroes. Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle. The path that split Buddhism in half 2,000 years ago and conquered half the world. The honest summary. Mahayana claimed to reveal the Buddha's true teaching. The established schools called it fabrication, corruption, heresy. The text appeared 4 centuries after the Buddha's death, with no clear provenance. Mahayana said reality is empty, you're already a Buddha, and the established path was incomplete. They called themselves great and everyone else lesser. And it worked. They spread across Asia while Theravada stayed regional. Who was right? Were the new sutras authentic revelations or brilliant innovations? Is the Bodhisattva path higher than the Arhat path, or different? The historical evidence is complicated. We don't have records proving where these texts came from. We can't definitively say if they're authentic Buddha word or brilliant later compositions created by Buddhist communities. But what's remarkable, it didn't matter in the end. What mattered was what happened because of these texts. They changed Buddhism. They spread it across continents. They gave millions of people a path they could actually walk. Mahayana asks you to believe this. The moment you're finally free is the moment you choose not to leave. The moment you achieve everything the Buddha taught is the moment you turn around. Enlightenment isn't leaving suffering behind. It's having the freedom to walk back into it. That's not just a new teaching. That's a complete reversal of what enlightenment was supposed to be. And that's why it changed everything. The elder traditions say, that's insanity. Enlightenment means escape. Mahayana says enlightenment means having the freedom to stay. Today, over 500 million Mahayana practitioners. When you see Zen meditation, Tibetan monks, the Dalai Lama, that's Mahayana. When you hear about mindfulness in the West, usually traced back through Zen. The controversial reform movement became the face of Buddhism globally. Whether the texts were authentic or not, whether the philosophy is higher or different, Mahayana did something remarkable. It took enlightenment, the ultimate personal achievement, and made it about everyone else. And that's why it spread. Next time, we're going deeper into what the Bodhisattva path actually demands. The vow to save all beings across infinite lifetimes. What that means, what it costs, and whether it's the most beautiful thing a human can do or the most impossible. See you then. Two paths, both leading to enlightenment. One exits, one returns. Which one did the Buddha really teach? Or maybe the question was never where to go, but whether you leave at all. If this video helped you understand Mahayana Buddhism, the split, the controversy, the path that chose compassion over escape, hit that like button. Subscribe for the next video where we dive deep into the Bodhisattva vow itself. I'm genuinely curious, which path feels right to you? The one that leaves, or the one that comes back? Drop your answer in the comments. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay wise.